Welcome to Unbiased Science.
Where we bring scientific method to the madness.
We're your hosts, Dr. Jess Steier
and Dr. Sarah Scheinman.
And today we are joined by such a special guest. I'm freaking out a little bit right now. I feel like we're really chatting with a celebrity. Dr. Caitlin Rivers, who specializes in outbreak science. My goodness, is this a very timely and hot topic? So we're going to get into it. Lots of outbreaks, pandemics, all kinds of things that we'll touch upon. But before we do, we have a little bit of an icebreaker. So here's the question for all. What did you think you were going to be, or what did you want to be when you were a child? Caitlin, do you want to? Yeah.
Well, after I got past the singer/actress phase that I think all small children go through, I landed on medical doctor, which I think precedes epidemiology for a lot of people who end up in public health. Public health, epidemiology in particular, is one of those careers that there's not a lot of visibility or awareness of. So if you have a sense you like science, you like health, I think medical doctor is where a lot of people start. But I quickly went on to epidemiology and have been there ever since.
Love it. Similar story, but I'll wait. Sarah, go on.
Yeah, I mean, I have crippling stage fright, so I did not go through a actor-singer phase when I was younger. However, when I was in middle school, Grey's Anatomy came out for the first time, and so I was like, this is cool. I want to be a surgeon. And then I kind of realized a little bit more of like what that entails, and I actually did take a brief detour to medical school before I became a research scientist, but that's a longer story for another time. And now I really want to be an astronaut, but I'm a neurobiologist. So there you go.
I love that, Sarah. So when I was very young, I was sure I was going to be a veterinarian. Love animals, absolutely love animals. But then it dawned on me that you're dealing with sick animals and sometimes not great outcomes. So that was quickly a no-go for me. And then Caitlin, very similar to you, thought the whole, med school thing, but that was not what I was passionate about. It was the healthcare, the math, the numbers. And so I ended up in public health, data science as well, evaluation science. So similar. All right. One more question. I feel like we have to ask this if we're talking about outbreaks, pandemics, and all that good stuff. Did you have a pandemic hobby? Early on when we were all locked in our house, what were you doing, Caitlin?
I sure did not, because I specialize in outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. I was flat out busy the entire time. All three of my kids were home, of course. I had 1-year-old twins at the time, and my oldest was 5. And so I had no hobbies at all. I'm not sure I even slept during that whole period. But sometimes I joke with my friends, like, of course, you have a little bit of a dark humor if you're in this field. Like, next pandemic, count me out. I'm doing the sourdough. I'm doing the gardening. Like, I need to squeeze that in.
Caitlin, twin 1-year-olds? Holy cow. That, first of all, like, with no pandemic, that would be a lot. So props to you. Amazing.
It was terrible. I don't know how any of us survived with our sanity intact, because it was really tough.
No.
Oh my God.
Sarah, what were you doing?
I'm proudly childless. But I was actually in graduate school during the pandemic, so naturally I had that going on, and took on about a dozen new hobbies, including lock picking, yoga, tabletop role playing games. I got into a lot of new video games, the Zelda Breath of the Wild series, if anyone's into that. Played many an hour of that, watched every single one of the Marvel movies and Star Wars movies in order with some of my friends who I was living with at the time, my roommates. And I don't want to say I had a very productive quarantine, but I got a lot done.
Okay, so just a little different than Caitlin's experience. And so I did some of the sourdough, some of the baking, some of that, a lot of virtual cooking classes. But I was telling Sarah another thing that I did. So my husband's an ER doc, and so we were sure. I mean, there was a point where we were sure that he was going to get very sick, if and potentially die and bring it home. And we always joke, like, my immune system's crap, like I'd be the first one gone. So got into little will writing and end of life directive and all that good stuff. So little dark, but yeah, luckily didn't have to use any of those things. But so on that very happy note, not to make anyone feel uncomfortable, I just tickled Sarah right now. She's just dying over this. All right.
I'm dark and twisted, which I am, but
Well,
like, come on.
you are. So now they know the real you. Wait, actually, before we get into things, I have to read Dr. Caitlin Rivers' bio. It is so impressive. You'll understand why I'm freaking out right now. It's a public health data scientist. I mean, this is like just, I can't even talk. But okay. Dr. Caitlin Rivers is a distinguished epidemiologist and associate professor at Johns Hopkins University with a PhD in epidemiology and an MPH in infectious diseases. Her work focuses on improving outbreak response and pandemic preparedness policies and practices. Some highlights of her career, and oh my goodness, there are many. We will link to her bio in our show notes. Helping to found the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. I have so many questions. Multiple roles in the federal government, bringing her expertise to national level decision making. And she's a prolific writer, contributing to major publications such as the New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and Nature. She is also the author of Force of Infection, which is a newsletter that everyone needs to subscribe to immediately. It's dedicated to tracking and analyzing outbreaks, epidemics, and pandemics. The newsletter provides weekly weather reports on respiratory and stomach bug activity in the U.S., as well as food recalls during peak seasons. Her insights have given early warnings on significant public health events, such as the tripledemic and norovirus surges. And may I just jump in? If you're looking at the video and you notice that my color is a little off, it's because I may actually have norovirus right now, and I spent all morning in the bathroom not feeling so hot. So it's the irony. Yeah, anyway, who knows? Norovirus, not sure, something's going on. But anyhow, Sarah, you love to kick off an episode with, setting the stage with a nice definition here. So maybe you could just start off, like, when we say pathogen, what happens to the body when you become infected with a pathogen? Just set the stage a little bit before we start picking Caitlin's brain about multiple outbreaks that we're experiencing.
Absolutely. I feel I'm in the presence of two public health goddesses right now, and I am over here but a humble biologist. So I will start things off by just giving a little bit of an overview of kind of what happens when we get infected with a pathogen. And first of all, what are we talking about when we say pathogen? Pathogens, I feel, are also often referred to as germs, maybe is a term that most people are familiar with. And these can come in many shapes and sizes, including bacteria, so we can get bacterial infections, infections from protozoa, from fungi, and then most commonly, I think, the type of pathogen that causes the majority of pandemics and epidemics are viruses. So let's just use the virus as an example of, what happens when we get infected by a virus. So you both have small children. So let's take the example. So a child sneezes in your face. And then, what happens then? Like, how do we go from that to being full blown ill on the couch, not being able to move? So how does this cause disease? So from the pathogen's perspective, from the perspective of the virus, there are a few different stages in what causes a disease. So the first stage is adhesion. So the virus is going to enter the body, and usually it enters the body through the path of least resistance. So let's just say it enters the body through the front door if it's open. So that could be through the nose, the mouth, the eyes, any other opening in the body. So the virus enters the body, we'll say through the epithelial cells lining the nasal passage. All right, so the second stage is we have invasion. So then the virus is going to come in and it's going to invade the cells. And how I like to think about it is kind of if you get a virus on your computer and you open up a suspicious looking email, which you should never do, but say you do that, and it hijacks the machinery of your computer, and it just takes over the entire machine. So that's kind of what's happening in the invasion stage. The pathogen is going to come in and it's going to take over your cells. And shortly following that, we have infection. And this is what happens when the virus and the pathogen is going to multiply and infect other neighboring cells. And at this point, this is kind of where you're going to start to experience most of the symptoms. This is where you're going to get really sick. And then the fourth and final stage is going to be transmission. And that is when the host, or when you start to sneeze and move the virus to other people, children's, adults, whoever's nearby, and you restart the process all over again. So it's a lovely cycle. So broadly speaking, that is what happens when we get infected by a pathogen.
Thank you. That was amazing. Thank you, Sarah. So now, Caitlin, let's talk. So we're talking about okay. Thank you, Sarah, setting the stage about infections and how we get sick. Now, how does something move? First of all, how do we go? How do we even start an outbreak? And then how does that outbreak then turn into an epidemic and then a pandemic? Can you take us through that evolution?
Sure. So an outbreak starts when someone becomes infected. For many pathogens with pandemic potential, that original virus jumps from animals to humans. These are known as zoonotic pathogens. Once a human becomes infected, if they are capable of replicating that virus and transmitting to others, then quickly a small outbreak of a single person can grow to an outbreak that affects a household or a community. Now, when things really get troublesome is when those humans move from one place to another, bringing with them the virus or the pathogen to other communities. If the footprint of that outbreak gets large enough, we consider it an epidemic. So there's no really hard and fast rule for when an outbreak becomes an epidemic, but generally, if it's crossing borders, if it's a regional event, then we're entering epidemic territory. If the event grows even larger than that, potentially affecting several continents, then it's considered a pandemic. Not all pathogens are capable of causing a pandemic. Not all transmit well enough to really get moving like that. But we obviously pay special attention to the ones that do have that capacity.
So is there like a contagion factor? Is that what you're talking about? Like that's going to predict whether something has the potential to become epidemic, pandemic? And is there there's no set threshold, right? Is it like there's a certain contagion factor that, trigger that it's on our radar, or is it less exact?
There are certain families of pathogens, viruses in particular, but some bacteria that are known to have pandemic potential because of how easily they spread and some of the other epidemic dynamics, some of the other transmission characteristics. But the one simple number that we use to evaluate whether an outbreak is growing or whether it's shrinking or whether it stay the same is the reproduction number. And if you've ever seen the movie Contagion, there's a cute scene with Kate Winslet she goes through this. But basically, the reproduction number is the average number of secondary cases per primary case. So it's just if I become sick and I pass it to 2 other people, then my reproduction number would be 2. And you can imagine on a population scale, you can sort of average this and figure out whether or not the pathogen is growing in its spreading, or whether it is shrinking. A reproduction number of 1 means the outbreak is staying about the same size. So 1 person transmits to 1 person. And so over time, the same number of people grow. Anything above 1 is a positive growth.
Okay. And now for COVID, I know I'm sort of jumping the gun, I'm getting specific, or for SARS-CoV-2, has that number changed over time? Was it initially more infectious and now it's less? Can you talk about that virus specifically?
The reproduction number is always changing based on the human population and the environment. For example, you can imagine that cities have more potential for a high reproduction number than very rural areas because there's more people to get infected. Early in the pandemic, there was nobody with immunity. The entire world was susceptible. And so the reproduction number of the virus was on the higher end. It's funny, I used to be able to tell you second by second what the reproduction number was at that time, right. But it's left me a little bit. But as more and more people became infected and eventually vaccinated, the number of people available to become infected fell. And so the reproduction number fell. Now, with SARS-CoV-2 specifically, there's a wrinkle, which is that we keep getting new variants. And some of those variants are more transmissible than previous variants. For example, the original SARS-CoV-2 that emerged in 2019, 2020 was not as transmissible as some of the variants that we see now. And so that is why the reproduction number went up with some of those variants and then fell again over time. It's fluctuating.
Right. And Sarah, you were talking about that, I think, on our episode recently on the different vaccines about the mutations and the different variants and how it's not surprising that these newer variants are more infectious, right? It's not like the viruses have a brain, but they're evolving to,
right. It all
be more infectious.
Exactly. It all comes down to the evolution of the virus itself. And I mean that it's going to take the variants that can replicate and infect more hosts are going to be more opportunistic. They are therefore going to become more prevalent. So it does make sense that the variants that we see that are most common in the population are the ones that are most easily transmissible.
Well, that's like when I see these headlines that are new variant and it's the most contagious and most infectious one. It's like, yeah, hello.
Yeah.
Like, this shouldn't be all that surprising. All right. So, So, Caitlin, there's another term that we hear a lot, and that's endemic. So when does something become endemic? And then I have a follow-up question that you may or may not be able to predict, is sort of the $1 million question. So let's talk about endemicity, please.
Endemic just means that a pathogen circulates regularly. It's not going away. It may be seasonal. So flu, for example, is endemic, but we really only experience flu at any significant levels in the winter. But we do see it year over year. And so that makes it endemic. Now, I feel like I know what your question is going to be. Early in the pandemic, there was hope, hope probably captures it best, that we would be able to bring SARS-CoV-2 under control such that it is not does not become endemic. Based on what we know now about SARS-CoV-2, that's very improbable because it spreads very easily. It has a lot of animal hosts. And so there's no way that we would be able to stop transmission entirely. But if you rewind back to 2003, the ancestor of SARS-CoV-2, which is just SARS-CoV, it was brought under control and no longer circulates. And so that was kind of the pattern or the model of thinking maybe we can put an end to this.
So would you say COVID is now endemic? And then follow-up question, when someone says, are we still in a pandemic? How do you answer that question?
It is endemic. We will live with it year over year into perpetuity, at minimum until we invent a vaccine that stops transmission. So yes, it is endemic. I do think we've moved from a pandemic to an endemic state. That's not a comment on the severity of the situation or the risk to the individual or the population. It really just refers to the epidemic dynamics. And because we are now nearly 5 years in and we are seeing these twice yearly surges, I do think we've reached a state of endemicity.
Now you come, and I'm sorry, Sarah, I know I'm like firing away because I am in the zone right now.
By all means, I am learning a lot. I am just riveted over here.
So Caitlin, you mentioned how, we can sort of predict flu seasons, right? We know when to expect those surges in cases. Can we say the same for COVID, or is it less predictable? Do we not fully understand, its seasonality? Is there seasonality to COVID?
This is a bit of an open question. There are some epidemiologists who think that the annual patterns may still be in flux. I feel like we've now had several years of a summer surge and then a larger surge in the winter. I don't see any reason why we wouldn't expect that going forward. There's no open questions or variables that could change, in my opinion. So, for example, before we had vaccines, you could think, oh, well, maybe when we get vaccines, that will change the annual pattern. Well, we have vaccines and we have for a while. And so there's no kind of question marks like that make me think that we can expect anything different going forward. Now, I will say the exact timing of the waves it's maybe not difficult to predict, but it's not what I thought. For example, this summer we had a quite serious wave and it came earlier than I expected it. And so there can still be some variability or some uncertainty about when exactly we can expect surges, but I think summer and winter is generally correct.
Now, when we're talking about pandemics, are we, or I don't know, and epidemics and outbreaks, are we only talking about viruses?
No, there are bacteria that have pandemic potential. Tuberculosis, for example, is one of those pathogens that we don't call a pandemic and don't think of as a pandemic in the same way that we do SARS-CoV-2 because it has been circulating for so long and is kind of a well-established, well-known problem. But tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria and has an enormous footprint and certainly can transmit easily from person to person without adequate control measures. So it's possible, but viruses are definitely the main culprit, the main candidate for the next pandemic pathogen.
Now, okay, next question is, and I don't know, well, I have a million questions, but okay, how would you say that we handled COVID, the COVID pandemic? Would you, or maybe we could just comment on what did we do well? What were maybe some lessons, things we could have done better? Any commentary on that? I don't know if that's controversial to ask. I'm so curious what she thinks.
No, I mean a few strong points were early detection. We being the global public health community identified the emergence of SARS-CoV-2 very quickly after it first appeared in the world, as far as we know, early days of China, and then we were able to track it fairly well as it moved across the world, Italy, New York City, for example. And so I do think that there's a strength there. And of course, the advent of the vaccines is probably one of the greatest medical moonshots in history. And so I think that is absolutely a testament to the strength and value of the biomedical enterprise. But there were also a lot of really rough spots. I talk about this in my book, Crisis Averted, which is coming out on October 8th. I think communication with the public was a real weakness. I think that there were a lot of missteps, some of which are still thematically similar to missteps that I see today. One I would highlight in particular is an unwillingness to level with the public about the severity of what we were going to face. I think that senior leaders in the US government said the risk to the American public is low, well after it was obvious that the risk was not low. And I think that does a real disservice to people to not bring them along as the situation is unfolding, help them to understand what we're likely to face and prepare themselves and their families. And so I think communication was a real gap and a real misstep. I could probably go on and on, like the highs and lows, but communication, I really want to emphasize as a major weakness because we have opportunity to communicate about outbreaks and epidemics all the time. And so when you're approaching the question of what do we say to the public, how do we say it, when do we say it, I think with the wrong attitude, that is a mistake that we continue to make.
1000%. And I don't know, as a science communicator, I'm constantly dealing with people saying, or not understanding, I don't know, it's a combination of not understanding the scientific process and how viruses evolve and change and how, yes, we are in a very different place than we were in March of 2020, but also there were failures of communication. I'm in total agreement. But a big thing that comes up is, masking, how, you changed your tune about how we didn't need to mask, then we did need to mask, and now people don't know whether they should or shouldn't be masking, and all this. And I like to tell them, I mean, this was a novel virus. We didn't fully understand, all the different aspects of how it was transmitted and how lethal and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
Sorry, Sarah.
I was just going to say to the point of the failure of communication, I think one of the things that was so scary to the public about the COVID pandemic in particular, with regards to the lack of communication, was because for a lot of people, this was the first time that they were experiencing the scientific process in real time. And one of the things that I love the most about science is that it's constantly in flux and that there oftentimes is not a very clear right and wrong answer. It's really not binary, which is a very common misconception about science. A lot of people think, oh, it's fact-based. Well, to an extent it is, but I mean, if you reach a certain level of science, it's very much in flux. It's a dynamic process. It's always changing. And what's right on one day might be called into question the next with the advent of additional data. And that's what makes it such a beautiful thing, but also what makes it so tricky for a lot of people, because it requires you to sit with that uncertainty, which a lot of people don't necessarily or are not comfortable associating with science.
Well, and I think science communicators, or public health communicators at least, put a lot of pressure on themselves to give the one forever answer. And I think that the way to navigate the changing science and the uncertainty with the need to communicate something to the public is to explain. I do think that, although I agree that it's hard to sit with uncertainty, I think there's a lot of ways that people already have a familiarity with the uncertainties of science, and it may be specific to that domain, but I think it's transferable. And one that comes to mind for me is storm forecasting. Meteorologists start talking about hurricanes before they're even formed. There's one kind of brewing right now, and I'm not exactly sure what the meteorologists are saying when they're describing the waves and the atmosphere and whatever. But I understand that they are telling me that they are not exactly sure what's going to happen. They have some concerns. They may dissipate, they may strengthen, and that I should pay attention. And I feel like that kind of bringing the public along with the message is not something that we're very comfortable with in public health. And I think that's a real opportunity for us to evolve.
Oh, I love that so much. I agree. We have to lean into the nuance. We have to share the uncertainties. I am in total agreement, because otherwise I feel like then we're falling into the same patterns as those who put out misinformation, the very absolutist, very black and white. This is all good. This is all bad. So I'm in total agreement. All right. Lots of ground to cover. Let's say, okay, so there are other outbreaks that are, percolating and happening right now. Mpox, there's avian flu, measles, which absolutely terrifies me given how contagious it is. Where should we jump in, Caitlin? I don't know. Does one speak to you right now that where we can start the conversation?
Yeah, it is. It's a long list right now. I would also identify Marburg in Rwanda as a new threat. That Marburg is a very serious viral hemorrhagic fever. So I'll leave it to you to pick the entry point.
Well, let's start there. This is not on my radar. I'm glad that we're chatting. And it looked like, Sarah, you were surprised as well. I don't know.
Nor is it on mine.
Okay. Well, thank goodness for Caitlin. Tell us.
Marburg is a viral hemorrhagic fever. It is a relative of Ebola, but unlike Ebola virus disease, there is no vaccine for Marburg. The case fatality rate exceeds 50%. It is a very deadly virus, and it spreads from person to person through close contact. Caregiving, in particular, healthcare workers can be at particular risk because of their relationship to patients with viral hemorrhagic fever. There is currently an outbreak in Rwanda. It was just announced over the weekend. And one of the things that concerns me about this outbreak is it already has a pretty big geographic footprint. So if memory serves, 6 health districts are affected. This means that the virus has moved around and is now, there are multiple locations that public health officials will have to pay attention to in order to implement control measures, which is obviously a much more logistically complex situation than if you have a single epicenter where you can devote all of your attention.
You said a case fatality rate of over 50%. Oh my gosh.
Unfortunately, yes.
Wow. And it's highly contagious?
It's highly contagious in the sense that family living, caregiving, those are environments where we see a lot of transmission. It is not public transportation or casual contact transmissible, probably in part because people with Marburg are so desperately ill that they're not out and about. I just want to make that distinction because we've seen across all of the different kinds of outbreaks that it matters a great deal when they're transmitted and what kind of condition people are in when they're infectious. And so this is really one that requires very close and sustained contact.
Sarah, where you look like you're about to ask something.
So you said it's similar to Ebola.
That's right.
Right? And just to clarify, case fatality rate of 50% means that 50% of people that are infected will end up dying from this.
Based on what we know, yes. And some estimates of the case fatality risk are even higher than 50%. You see 60%, 75%. It's a very serious viral hemorrhagic fever.
Wow.
Oh my God. You just like took our breath away. This is wow. Okay, so this is on the radar in a very real way. So you said, so we have a vaccine for Ebola, but we don't have one for this. I would imagine, I mean, well, that's another conversation. I'd be curious if they're related. Does that make it potentially easier to develop a vaccine for this? I would imagine that's in the works, maybe. I don't know. But wow, this is, sorry, Caitlin, go on.
There are candidate vaccines that are in the research and development pipeline. I don't know if any of them are ready to field. I hope so because, well, first of all, because of the potential for them to offer protection, although, of course, we don't know until we finish trials.
Mhm.
But also, outbreaks are important opportunities to test candidate vaccines so that during the next outbreak, you have a product available. This was one of the very few silver linings of the 2014 Ebola outbreak, which was a desperate tragedy. But the vaccine was fielded in time to allow scientists to collect data to determine that it was safe and effective. And now, fast forward 9 years, and there are Ebola vaccines that clinicians can offer to people in affected communities.
Wow. Okay, if we can move on, I would love to talk about measles. Measles, I keep reading news stories of outbreaks. There was just one in Minnesota. I was trying to pull up the stats on that. Twin Cities area is grappling with a significant measles outbreak, 51 confirmed cases, including 9 new cases in September alone. It has already led to 12 hospitalizations. The outbreak reached Minneapolis Elementary School, where over 25% of students were not fully vaccinated. The majority of cases are concentrated among unvaccinated children. There is a particular community, the Somali community, that was hit quite hard with 24 cases occurring in children age 1 to 5. I mean, I could go on, but measles is it the most highly contagious? It is, right? I can't think of anything else that's more contagious. Does it have why is 18 the number that's standing out to me? I might have made that up. Is that the
reproduction number for measles has been estimated anywhere from 12 to 18. It is by far the most infectious virus that is known to man. Thankfully, we have a very safe and effective vaccine. It's usually given in the measles, mumps, rubella formulation, or MMR. But vaccination coverage rates in the United States have been declining, as I'm sure you know. And so that is creating pockets of children who are susceptible. And anytime you have a clustering of people who are susceptible, that is tinder for an outbreak.
Tinder? That's the perfect word. I mean, really, it's scary to me to think of that, and to your point, we have the MMR vaccine after 2 doses. It's something like 97, 98% effective. This is so highly preventable, and it makes me crazy when I see the uptake rates declining. Sarah, again, I can't tell if you're jumping in or if you're just deep in thought here.
Oh,
You're taking it all in.
I'm
Yeah,
taking it all in, but
you're
also
taking it in.
so this is considered right now just an outbreak, right, Caitlin? It's not something, we have not reached endemic status with measles yet, correct?
It is just an outbreak, and it's interesting that you raise the prospect of endemicity because around 2001, measles was declared eliminated from the United States. So we
That's
reached
what I
an
thought.
official status that declares that measles is not a problem in the United States anymore. There is questions about whether sometime in the future we will lose our measles-free status because of these repeated outbreaks. Now, I think in order to lose your elimination status, you have to have sustained transmission for, I want to say it's a year. So we're not there, thankfully. But if we continue to have this popcorning of outbreaks in Minnesota and New York City and Oregon, then it's not impossible that we would someday face a situation of losing elimination status.
And with a pathogen that is so highly transmissible and infectious, we need to have a very high vaccine coverage rate, right, to really block that transmission. And I can't remember for measles, I think it's at least 90%, right?
Yeah,
I thought
right.
It was even higher than that. And there are many counties across the U.S. that are far below that threshold. So this is one that really freaks me out.
Well,
There's a
Um,
misconception too that measles is mild, but in fact, about half of the people who have been diagnosed with measles this year have been hospitalized. And so it's not true that it's a mild pathogen. It can actually be quite dangerous.
Thank you for adding that. Absolutely. Sorry, Sarah, you were saying something.
No, I mean, this is seriously something we need to be concerned about, and even with the 90% vaccination rate, we're seeing all of these outbreaks. So
Although Caitlin, correct me if I'm mistaken, but most of the outbreaks we're seeing, I think, are in communities where we're seeing levels lower than that 90%. Thus, really underscoring the importance of vaccination. And I did want to point out there are, for parents who might be listening whose kids have not yet received that second dose, there are ways where you can get an earlier dose if you are living in an area with an active outbreak, or if you're traveling to an area with an active outbreak. I have the details of all of that we have them on our page, and I could reshare the stories and link in show notes. Okay, what else? Mpox. Where do we stand with Mpox, Caitlin?
In 2022, there was an epidemic of Mpox that primarily affected men who have sex with men. It was transmitted through close, intimate sexual contact, and it was pretty confined to the gay community. What we're seeing now, though, is a change in the epidemiology of that virus. The 2022 outbreak was caused by clade 2, and that just describes the specifics of the kind of virus. But what we've seen recently is an emergence of clade 1b, again, a related but slightly different virus. And we're seeing that clade 1b is spreading more easily between people through heterosexual intimate contact, household contact, maybe contaminated linens and contaminated items. And the consequence of the change in this kind of epidemiology is that it's spreading quite rapidly, quite severely, right now in parts of Africa. So the Democratic Republic of Congo is heavily affected, Burundi, and we're seeing kind of the footprint of that outbreak grow and grow and grow. And so that does raise concerns for me about what we may face importations here in the United States.
And do
And
we
I saw-
have an
oh, sorry.
Mpox? Sorry, do we have an Mpox vaccine? Is that
We do. Yes, we have the Jynneos vaccine, which is given in 2 doses.
Okay.
And on that note, I saw New York State, at least, I'm not sure if other places, they sort of relaxed the vaccine requirement. You no longer need a prescription, I don't believe, in New York State. I think you could opt to get the vaccine if you feel inclined to do so. So, yeah, wow. Sarah, any other questions about Mpox?
It always confused me why you need a prescription to get a vaccine.
I don't have an answer to that.
It just seems like, I mean, because I got my flu shot yesterday. I just went up and I was like, hey, can I get a flu shot? And they were like, yep, sure.
Right.
That seems to be that should be how easy it should be.
I think for Mpox, it was because previously it was really a very specific population that was getting the vaccine. And so you had to sort of be deemed high risk. I'm not sure if it was potentially and I'm sorry that I don't know this, but due to a limited supply potentially of vaccines, and they were sort of being limited to high risk populations. That might be a consideration here. And I don't know if you know offhand, Caitlin, but that would be my sense. Yeah.
The vaccine was and is available to men who have sex with men, sex workers, other people with specific exposures or specific risk factors. But just recently, CDC did expand the recommendation to allow people who are traveling to DRC or other affected areas to receive the Jynneos vaccine. So you're right, it has to do, I think, with the risk factors of the who's at risk.
Yeah. All right, Caitlin, we have to talk avian flu. I don't know. Actually, I was totally riveted to your newsletter on this because not a great update came out just I think it was a couple of weeks ago at this point, that there was a human case of H5N1 avian influenza reported in Missouri without known contact with infected birds or animals, raising concerns about potential new transmission pathways. So, Caitlin, can you sort of what are we talking about here? Initially we were mainly just concerned about farm workers who are in direct contact with birds. There was, people should not be drinking raw. Well, why are we talking about raw milk? What are we talking about here?
Sure. So H5N1 is a highly pathogenic influenza. It is not the seasonal flu that we get vaccinated against and takes down about a third of us each year. It is a different specific kind of influenza. It's been circulating very widely in wild birds for years now. And all of that circulation around the world has given it an opportunity to find new hosts, find new animals to infect. So this spring, it was identified in dairy cattle in Texas. And quickly, epidemiologists and their veterinary counterparts realized that really dairy herds around the country had become infected with H5N1. This was a very surprising development because cows are not known to be common hosts for any kind of influenza. So that was definitely a startling development. Now, one of the consequences or results of the virus making it into dairy cows is that those animals have a lot more contact with humans than wild birds. And so that human-animal interface gave the virus a lot of opportunities to find humans. And so over the course of the summer, there was something like 14 cases of H5N1 identified in farmers who had contact with infected animals, but there was never any evidence that it made it onto other humans. There was no human-to-human transmission. But just in the last few weeks, there's been another concerning development. So I do feel like there's sort of this drip of developments that makes me nervous. There was a man hospitalized in August with H5N1. And what was surprising about his infection is, or I suppose we don't actually know if it's a man or a woman, so I'll say there. What was surprising about their infection is that they did not have known contact with animals. And so it's a mystery about how this person became infected. Again, with the drip of concerning developments, what's emerged since the identification of that original illness, there are now 1 household contact and 6 healthcare workers who developed symptoms after contact with this infected person. None of those contacts were tested at the time. There was no reason to think they might have H5N1. None of this was known. And so a lot of testing is being done to understand whether or not those people had H5N1, which would be highly concerning, or whether they had COVID or some other respiratory illness. So we still do not have any firm evidence of human-to-human transmission, but this one mysterious case and then the 7 possible cases does raise the specter of human-to-human transmission.
Oh my God, you guys are like detectives.
Yeah, epidemiologists are known as disease detectives. That's
honestly,
right.
I would watch the crap out of a police procedural show, except not police procedural, just like epidemiologist procedural show, where it's just like you're like, well, it's a mystery, and like this person was infected, and how did they get infected? Because they didn't have any contact with birds, and this is fascinating. So cool.
It is. It's very much detective work, and it's very urgent, right? Because the longer it takes you to discover what's going on here, what the situation is, the more opportunity the virus has to creep away undetected and kind of make its way into a more concerning situation. And so urgency is absolutely a priority.
America loves true crime. So like, what about true epidemiology?
Ooh. Okay, you heard it here first. Love it. Well, Detective Rivers, how nervous are you? And I mean, I know it's hard to say, and we steer clear of fear-mongering on the pod, but as an epidemiologist, where does this fall on your radar? Like, is this something that is very concerning? I don't know. Can you comment at all on how you're feeling about this particular outbreak?
I am concerned. Pandemic influenza has always been identified as one of the possible big ones. A different kind of influenza, H1N1, was responsible for the 1918 pandemic, which of course was not the model, that's not the right word, but was sort of the nearest analogy to what we experienced in COVID-19. And ever since then, and several kind of epidemics or pandemics since, epidemiologists have known influenza has pandemic potential and could be a very serious. So I'm worried about it for that reason. And I'm also worried about it because it does seem to be creeping closer. It was in wild birds, and then it's in dairy cattle, and now there's this mysterious cluster in Missouri. Again, none of this it's not clear cut. It's not to say that this is going to be the next big one. But one of the perspectives that's been important to me as I've watched this evolve is that we don't need to call the ball, right? We don't need to accurately predict whether it will or it won't, because our job as public health professionals is to be ready and to prepare. And I think that there's enough going on here that we really do need to put a lot of resources into preparing for a possible flu pandemic and for being prepared to mitigate the consequences just in case.
Okay, we didn't even get to norovirus, but we might need to have a completely separate episode on that. And I'm just worried that if we talk about it, something's going to come up. So let's table that for now, if that's okay. I have one more big question for you, Caitlin, that I'm curious about. And Sarah, certainly feel free to jump in. I'm sure we both have tons of questions. How do you feel like we're prepared? I mean, I guess that I always hear, like, what if there's another pandemic? Do you feel like we're in a better position than we were in 2019? Do you feel like we've come a long way? Or how do you think we'd fare?
Unfortunately, I don't think that we're in a better position. We may actually be in a worse position, depending on how you weight the different factors. I think three innovations that are particularly strong are the Center for Forecasting and Outbreak Analytics, which Jesse mentioned. I was one of the founding members of. I'm very proud of that organization, and I think that does contribute to our readiness. So that is a new strength. Wastewater surveillance, I think, is a new strength that's really only become widespread since the pandemic. And the third is the mRNA vaccine platform, which is can very quickly let scientists spin up a new vaccine and move it into clinical trials. So those are the three strong points. But unfortunately, on the other side are many weaknesses. The trust in public health has degraded in the public substantially, and I think that's really going to detract from our ability to lean on the public or bring the public into public health control measures. Public health officials are very tired and worn out from the pandemic and from the constant pressures of underfunding. And so that is a big negative. And I think those two things alone are very substantially degrading our ability to respond. And one other point, actually, state legislatures have been very aggressively rolling back authorities from their public health departments. And so our legal ability to respond to outbreaks has also degraded.
And then I also think about our, frontline responders, again, just bringing up my husband who's an ER doc. I mean, they're burnt out, dealing with a public that is also burnt out and I feel like more divided than ever, riddled with misinformation. I mean, the fact that when you look at the thing that just blows my mind, I just remember early in 2020, we were all united for a time there in this fear against this unknown virus, right? Just a little short little sliver of time. And it was like, oh my gosh, we're working on a vaccine. Help is on the way. And then we get it. And now look at our numbers. We're begging people to get this vaccine. I mean, it just, I don't know, blows my mind. So for multiple reasons, all the reasons you laid out, then you look at our frontline first responders, healthcare clinicians, a public that's burnt out, doesn't trust the medical and scientific establishment. I don't know. I'm feeling very similarly to you, Caitlin, and it is really quite unfortunate. You'd think that we just went through this and we'd have learned some lessons. So very, yeah. Sorry to sort of end on that pessimistic note, but I do agree. I'm sorry. Okay, Sarah, you were going to say something. Do you have something less bleak, or are you team bleak?
Just more bleakness. What I was going to add is a failure that I think, in my opinion, a failure that we had was addressing the mental health of people during the pandemic. I think that a lot of people, I think that we definitely, the data is there to support that during the pandemic, especially during periods of quarantine, there were increased rates of depression and anxiety amongst the general public, and especially with regards to children and adolescents staying home from school and being held back from engaging socially during very crucial points in development. There have actually been a couple of studies on the neurological effects of this type of isolation on brain development in children, and what they have shown. Specifically, there was a study in the Journal of Scientific Reports looking specifically at pandemic-related social restrictions, and found that in young teenagers aged 9 to 13, I believe. This type of isolation was associated with structural changes in social brain regions and stress-related brain regions, including like abnormal developmental patterns, which is just to say that I think that this type of thing needs to be addressed for future pandemics, and we need to sort of have a better game plan of not only how to address the disease but also the ramifications to those who are just trying to be aware and quarantine and be safe as well.
Wow, wow, team. That was that was bleak. Caitlin, we cannot thank you enough for joining us today. Can you let folks know where we can follow how we could sign up to your Substack, which we'll link to our show notes, and just tell us about your book and where we can find it?
Sure. I have a new book coming out being published by Viking on October 8th. It's called Crisis Averted, and it's a look at the hidden science of fighting outbreaks, very much in line with what we are talking about today. You can also find my Substack, Force of Infection, on Substack.
Awesome. We will link to all the things, Caitlin. I mean, just thank you for all the work that you're doing. I feel like public health is such thankless work happening behind the scenes. And Sarah is, yes,
I know.
newfound just love and appreciation for epidemiology.
100%. 100%.
Disease detectives. Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Caitlin. And thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for your support. Of course, we have our own Substack. You can link to that. Follow along on all of our socials. Subscribe. Leave us a review. Sarah, that was short and sweet, but take us home.
All right, guys. I certainly learned a thing or two, and I hope that you did as well. Please join us next week on your trusted source for no nonsense, just science.